2024 WNBA draft took place at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in Brooklyn, New York, and allowed fans to be in attendance for the first time since the 2016 WNBA draft. Here is the first round. The number 1 overall pick belonged to the Indiana Fever. They selected Caitlin Clark out of the University of Iowa. The second overall pick belonged to the Los Angeles Sparks. They drafted Cameron Brink out of Stanford. The third pick belonged to the Chicago Sky. They drafted Camila Cardozo out of South Carolina. The fourth pick belonged to the Los Angeles Sparks. They drafted Rickea Jackson out of Tennessee. The fifth pick belonged to the Dallas Wings. They drafted J.C. Sheldon out of Ohio State. The sixth pick belonged to Aaliyah Edwards. She was drafted by the Washington Mystics. The sixth pick belonged to the Washington Mystics, and they drafted Aaliyah Edwards out of UConn. The seventh pick belonged to the Chicago Sky. They drafted Angel Reese out of LSU. The eighth pick belonged to the Minnesota Lynx. They drafted Alyssa Peely out of Utah. The ninth pick belonged to the Dallas Wings. They drafted Carla Late out of France. The 10th pick belonged to the Connecticut Sun. They drafted Layla Lacan out of France. The 11th pick belonged to the New York Liberty. They drafted Marquisha Davis out of Ole Miss. And the final pick in the first round of the 2024 WNBA draft, the 12th pick belonged to the Atlanta Dream. They drafted Nadu Pouch out of Australia. In the second round, the 13th pick belonged to the Chicago Sky. They drafted Brenna Maxwell out of Gonzaga. The 14th pick belonged to the Seattle Storm. They drafted Nika Mule out of UConn. The 15th pick belonged to the Indiana Fever. They drafted Celeste Taylor out of Ohio State. The 16th pick belonged to the Las Vegas Aces. They drafted Deasia Fair out of Syracuse. The 17th pick belonged to the New York Liberty. They drafted Esmery Martinez out of Arizona. The 18th pick belonged to the Las Vegas Aces. They drafted Kate Martin out of Iowa. The 19th pick belonged to the Connecticut Sun. They drafted Tiana Jackson out of Kansas. The 20th pick belonged to the Atlanta Dream. They drafted Isabel Borlase out of Australia. The 21st pick belonged to the Washington Mystics. They drafted Kaylin Trung out of Gonzaga. The 22nd pick belonged to the Connecticut Sun. They drafted Helena Puello out of Arizona. The 23rd pick belonged to the New York Liberty. They drafted Jessica Carter out of Mississippi State. And the 24th pick in the final pick in the second round of the 2024 WNBA draft, the 24th pick belonged to the Las Vegas Aces. They drafted Elizabeth Kitley out of Virginia Tech. And in the third and final round, pick number 25 belonged to the Phoenix Mercury. They drafted Charisma Osborne out of UCLA. The 26th pick belonged to the Seattle Storm. They drafted Mackenzie Holmes out of Indiana. The 27th pick belonged to the Indiana Fever. They drafted Leilani Correa out of Florida. The 28th pick belonged to the Los Angeles Sparks. They drafted Mackenzie Forbes out of USC. The 29th pick belonged to the Phoenix Mercury. They drafted Jazz Shelley out of Nebraska. The 30th pick belonged to the Washington Mystics. They drafted Natasha Claessens out of Belgium. The 31st pick belonged to the Minnesota Lynx. They drafted Kiki Jefferson out of Louisville. The 32nd pick belonged to the Atlanta Dream. They drafted Matilda Villa out of Italy. The 33rd pick belonged to the Dallas Wings. They drafted Ashley Owusu out of Penn State. The 34th pick belonged to the Connecticut Sun. They drafted Abby Sue out of Columbia. The 35th pick belonged to the New York Liberty. They drafted Caitlin Davis out of USC. And in the final pick in the 2024 WNBA draft, pick number 36 belonged to the Las Vegas Aces. They drafted Angel Jackson out of Jackson State.